So, do you know who won the Nobel Prize for Economics this year? So, these two guys who basically came up with a very logical framework as to why some nations are rich while others are poor, and they documented their logical explanation in a book called Why Nations Fail. And they figured out that nations basically fail or succeed on the basis of how strong the institutions are. And by institutions, they mean political institutions, institutions, law and order. So these are the criteria which are very, very important if the nation has to succeed or fail. And nations which have strong banking sector, law and order, and as well as strong workplace ethic and politics generally turn out to be richer compared to nations which do not have such systems. And in the book, they systematically break down why other factors are not so much responsible. For example, resources don't really decide if a nation is rich or poor. There are many countries which almost have no resources but are actually quite rich. Say, for example, the Scandinavian countries. And it's not even the culture that decides whether a nation is rich or poor, because in many parts of US where there is a US Mexico border, say for example in Arizona, the culture is more or less similar on this side and that side of the border. But on the US side, people are extremely rich, while on the Mexican side, people are very poor. And it's not even the ignorance of the politicians of a country that decide whether they are rich or poor. In a lot of countries, a lot of politicians were quite well aware that the policies and the rules they were actually setting was going to put the country in poverty, but they still did it. It wasn't like they were ignorant. They were very well aware of the situation. They did it because they made rules that they knew that would only and only benefit them. And that is why the nations turn out to be poor. This example is seen quite a bit in African countries, where the politicians are quite aware of what policies to set to actually help the people come out of the shackles of poverty, but they still don't do it because it does not benefit them directly. So what the takeaway is that the institutions of the country determine whether it's going to be rich or poor. Next, how does poverty affect you? Well, this reminds me of a very famous story that happened to Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer. And apparently, once he took a walk in a very, very poor neighborhood of where he was staying in Russia, apparently Moscow. And he was so disheartened and baffled by all the poverty. He saw that he took all his money and from which was in his pocket, and he gave it away to all the people there, and he came back home. So talking about money, money is the single biggest story that humans have put their trust into and that they collectively believe in. This is what I read in Yuval Noah Harari's book, Homo Sapiens. Well, basically, if you look at money, money does not have any real value in itself. I mean, you can't eat it, you can't really, make things out of it. It's just piece of paper. But it's the collective story that we have developed around money, that this piece of paper has a lot of value in it, and it can buy you things and it can afford you services. It's that entire story which is so powerful. And this is probably the single biggest story that unites all of mankind. Everybody wants to be rich and everybody wants more of money. If there is something that everybody unanimously believes in, it's money. So it's a very, very powerful construct, a story construct that we have created in the minds of everybody. And you must watch the podcast between Dr. Yuval Noah Harari and Lex Friedman. And podcast reminds me of another podcast between Joe Rogan and this guy called Dr. Carl Hart. So Dr. Carl Hart is a very interesting person. He's a neuroscientist who's doing research on drug use. and he wrote this book called Drug Use for Adults. And he's basically an advocate for pro drug use. He says that if you are responsible, then you can use even hard drugs like cocaine and heroin and methamphetamine very, very responsibly. And the entire narrative that these are hard drugs and these are really bad for you and you will get addicted is actually quite faulty. If you are responsible, if you actually know how you can alter your state of consciousness to make yourself happy, go ahead, use those drugs. And the entire narrative around it is just created to create some sort of media hype. And he's saying that addiction is also not really a drug problem. It's more it's more of a societal problem. It's the background that the people come from that gets them addicted. So what we must be addressing is actually the societal problems, the background, and not really the drug in itself. So it was a very eye-opening book, because it had this very interesting perspective that you can use these substances to alter your state of consciousness, and you can do it responsibly. So talking about biohacking, I ventured into another guy called Brian Johnson. He's a billionaire tech entrepreneur who's basically experimenting on his own body with de-aging, and he's taking all these sorts of drugs and has this very perfect routine. He wakes up on time, sleeps for 8 hours a day, and consumes his meal in a very, very scientific structured manner. Eats veggies and proteins, and after 11 a.m. doesn't eat at all. And he has these different body techniques that are being done on him, skin treatments, and he takes like 100 different prescription medicines. And what he's trying to do is he's basically trying to say that he doesn't want to die. He's creating a new movement, which is basically humans have achieved so many feats, so many technological revolutions have taken place, and now the next step is basically that humans should be able to hack their bodies so that they don't die. And he's able to reduce the speed of his aging by a significant factor, and he's an interesting person to do check him out. But his methods are really quite unscientific, because he isn't really taking one drug and seeing the effect of that drug on his body that the drug has on his body for aging. He's taking a lot of drugs and then seeing what effect all those drugs have. So you don't really know which drug is affecting what, and that's why his approach is not really that scientific. So interesting guy, but also very intense and unscientific. So what do you think about biohacking? So in biohacking, let's talk about this thing called Epicurean philosophy, which basically says that what we feel and perceive is the result of the brain biochemistry that we have. So say for example, if two people are going through the same situation, one person might feel very, very sad about that situation, while the other person, he doesn't really get affected by it. And what Epicurean philosophy says is that your reactions and your experiences in this life are not so much dependent on what is happening in the outside world, but what is really happening inside your brain, inside the neurons of your brain. So for the second person, his neurons and his brain biochemistry is just designed in such a way that he doesn't feel as much sorrow as the first person. And so we can really hack our brains to feel happy or sad by hacking the biochemistry of our brains. And that is what really antidepressants do. I mean, they are able to alter the biochemistry of your brain so that you start feeling a different way. And if possible, if you have access to like Brian Johnson and like Dr. Carl Hart, these different drugs that can change the brain biochemistry, I mean, why not? I'm a big time believer in scientific interventions of making your life more meaningful. And I hope this video elevates your mood and gives you a sense of purpose. So thank you and bye.